So, continuing with the cleanup of the UV map for the Vega interior, here I'm moving the seats together, selected together, into a corner, and going back to the 3D view for 3D editing. I'm going to do the dashboard next, but I'm going to clean up the seams first. And I didn't 100% succeed in this because the sides of the model are much sloppier than I realized, but I'm not going to completely fix them in this round of cleanup, because once I have the UV map saved as an image file, it will all be much easier to re-unwrap individual parts of the model, which you can do in Blender. I only did the brake lever, the handbrake lever, in this round because there was no alternative, because I had not properly marked the seams on it at all, it turned out. Whenever you do something cylindrical, it's best if you mark 2 seams on it rather than just 1. So that's in fact what I had to do. So in any case, I'm moving the pieces of the dash together here. It's shaped strangely, I think, because the surface on it is not 100% flat, because I chose to do a semi-detailed version of it as opposed to just a very vague shape with a texture. Basically, it was a compromise between detail and frame rates. And I may actually simplify this in the future, but for the moment, I'm going to go with a version of the model I started with. A lot of it has to be mapped in pieces because of the way I mark the seams. I mark the seams in this manner to make it easier to texture the gauges primarily. So I made it very conducive to the textures that eventually will go on. And we'll see if I got it right, because one of the things about this is you never really know how good your UV map is until you try to put a texture on it. So this cleanup I'm doing here is probably not going to be the last one. And some parts of a UV map can be quite out of scale. This is a good example of that, and that the sides of that indentation in the dash are very small, but the unwrap feature on Blender interpreted them as being very large, comparable to the center section, which is not the case at all. So bits and pieces here and there. Some of these may turn out to be in the wrong place, again, when I do the texture. This is going to be a little bit tricky, I think. Which again is part of the reason, maybe most of the reason, why I'm deliberately cleaning up this UV map to make it logical and easier to navigate. And as I said in the first part of this part of the project, part 10 as opposed to part 11, which is this one, I will end up unwrapping some of this a second time, probably. It is not likely that this is going to be satisfactory once I start texturing it. And it was 2 hours, 20 minutes of work, roughly, to do all of this. I've drastically reduced the length of this video because it wouldn't be watchable at the original length. And as I mentioned in the last video, this process of selecting each vertex one by one is actually not necessary. You can do Control L to select linked vertices, same as in the 3D view, which is something I discovered when I was working on this. Most of the instructions don't mention it because a part of the problem with a program like Blender is having comprehensive instructions online is a rather difficult thing to accomplish because it is a very complicated program, especially in its present version. There's the gear shift. This took me a little bit more time than I thought it would, because I wanted to line up every part of the gear shift in line so that it makes sense what everything is. And again, not perfectly to scale either. So I put it next to the console because that makes the most sense. Basically the console and here the brake lever and the other miscellaneous parts are all in one section. The seats are in another section. The floor is in another section. And the side is in another section. You'll see in a minute or two how that logically works. Here I'm doing the second unwrap for the handbrake, as I mentioned earlier. And because it's a single unwrap, it fills up the whole UV map, and so I have to shrink it, as well as rotate it and move it into a place where it's not a huge inconvenience. So it's overlapping the floor in that position, so I'm going to have to move it. Some of these parts I'm also going to have to verify exactly what they are, because even at this late stage I have not been able to navigate this UV map to the point where I understand where absolutely everything is. Like this piece here, it is not clear to me whether that is the directional lever, which I doubt. I don't think it is. Or whether it's some other sliver of a part connected to something. I think actually that's the section under the handbrake. I think it's the section of the console under the handbrake. I'm about 90% sure about that. But there are a lot of parts. And I didn't even do the most detailed model I could have done. Generally speaking, in gaming and those sorts of applications, having perfect detail is a disadvantage because it basically uses up your bandwidth and makes the game into a system hog. And once your frame rate goes, it's not much of a game, even if standing stationary somewhere it looks awfully nice. One of the challenges of computer graphics and gaming is to have a realistic looking scene without having terrible frame rates. And some of the way you do that is by having really nice textures, which is not easy, because making convincing textures requires real artistic skill. Especially when you can't use photographs the whole time. So there I accidentally moved a part of the side over, if you see there, so I was fixing that. Accidentally selected it along with the floor. So there we have it. We have the sides over on the left. We have the dashboard up in the upper right. In the middle and lower right, we have the seats, the floor in the lower center, and the miscellaneous parts in the upper center. I shrank the sides there a little bit so that it wouldn't overlap the sides of the map, which can be a problem. And here I'm cleaning up some of the vertices. These might be removed later when I clean up the original model. And there we have it. It's pretty complete, actually. So from this point, all I really have to do is make sure the materials are assigned correctly. So I'm redoing them there, basically. They probably isn't necessary, but I'm being especially careful. While I was at it, I also saved the actual outline of the UV map the way you're supposed to do. And I loaded then that image into the background, which doesn't look so good at this point because it still has the alpha. But anyway, that's it. Thanks for watching.